Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that knew more about your town than the town did about itself. The 1950s telephone operator. Not the friendly recorded voice you imagine. Not a robot politely asking you to press one for billing. I mean a real, living woman, sitting in a dim room wearing a heavy headset, plugging cords into a wall of holes, and quietly absorbing every affair, debt, breakup, and casserole recipe within 40 miles. She was the search engine, the group chat, and the gossip column all at once, except she was sworn to secrecy and paid almost nothing for the privilege. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a sincere thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas are honestly what keep this whole thing alive, and I never take that for granted. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always 2 a.m. somewhere. The channel is also now live on Spotify, if you'd rather drift off with just your ears. Links in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable, and try not to whisper any secrets out loud, because tonight, someone is always listening. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to know everyone's business and be forbidden from saying a word? Could you sit perfectly upright for 9 hours while a supervisor breathed down your neck counting your bathroom breaks? Would you survive a job where saying the wrong word in the wrong tone could get you fired before lunch? Could you memorize an entire town's worth of numbers without a single screen to help you? And if your neighbor was quietly falling apart on a shared phone line at midnight, could you really resist listening in? Be honest. And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1954. You have a uniform that itches, a voice that has to stay sweet no matter what, and a wall of blinking lights that all want something from you at once. Good luck. Let's start with how you ended up here. Because nobody's born wanting to plug cords into a board for a living. You're a young woman, probably between 17 and 25, unmarried, with neat hair and a clear speaking voice. Because those were practically job requirements. Maybe your mother worked the boards before you. Maybe the factory wasn't hiring and the telephone company was. Either way, you walked into a brick building downtown, sat through an interview where they judged your diction more than your resume, and got hired into one of the few respectable jobs a woman could hold in town. Congratulations. You're now the voice of the entire community, and you have absolutely no idea what you've signed up for. The hiring process was less about what you knew and more about how you sounded. A manager sat across from you and asked simple questions, but he wasn't really listening to your answers. He was listening to your voice. Was it clear? Did it carry warmth? Did you slur, mumble, or let a regional twang creep in too thick? A pleasant, neutral voice was your golden ticket, and a harsh or nasal one could end the interview before it began. It's a bit like being judged for a singing competition, where the only song is the word hello. Then came the physical inspection, which was every bit as judgmental. They looked at your posture, your hands, your grooming, your general air of respectability. The phone company wanted a certain kind of a young woman. Tidy, polite, dependable, and crucially, not the sort to cause a scandal. You were representing the company to the entire town, even if no one would ever see your face. So they checked you over like you were a prize heifer at a county fair, except the prize was a headset and a wooden chair. Your background mattered too in ways that feel deeply unfair now. They preferred unmarried women, because a wife might quit to raise children, and they often preferred a particular look and a particular kind of family reputation. In many towns, this meant the operators all came from a narrow slice of the community, hired as much for who they were as for what they could do. You weren't just applying for a job, you were applying to be the acceptable face, or rather the acceptable voice, of an entire town. Once hired, you weren't simply turned loose on the board. You went through training, learning the chords, the lights, the scripts, and the rigid etiquette of the work. You practice saying the company's phrases until they were carved into your tongue. You learn to sit for hours, to reach without straining, to keep your tones sweet under pressure. Older operators watched you, corrected you, and occasionally terrified you. It was less like starting a job and more like joining a strict, soft-spoken convent that happened to run on electricity. And the pay, modest, the prestige, surprisingly high. Being a telephone operator was considered clean, respectable work, a real step up from factory floors or domestic service. Families were proud to say their daughter worked the boards. Neighbours treated you with a touch of respect, knowing you held a position of trust. You walked a little taller, even as your paycheck stayed stubbornly thin. So there you are, freshly hired, neatly dressed, terrified and proud in equal measure, about to meet the machine that will dominate every waking hour of your working life. You think you understand what you've gotten into. You absolutely do not. Because waiting for you in that dim room is a towering wooden wall of holes and lights, and it is hungry. Now let's introduce you to your new co-worker, your nemesis, and the centre of your entire universe, the switchboard. Picture a towering wooden wall studded with hundreds of little holes, each one a doorway into someone's home or business. In front of you dangle dozens of cords tipped with brass plugs, coiled like sleeping snakes waiting to be yanked. Above the holes, tiny lights flicker on whenever someone lifts a receiver somewhere in town. Your job is to read those blinking lights, grab the right cords, and connect two people who want to talk, all in a few seconds, all without looking like you're sweating. It's like a slot machine, a loom, and a panic attack combined into one beautiful oak cabinet. Up close, the board is genuinely intimidating. Each little hole is called a jack, and each one connects to a specific line somewhere out in the world. There can be hundreds of them stacked in neat rows in front of you, rising up like a wall just beyond arm's reach. Below them sit the cords, arranged in pairs, each pair able to bridge two jacks together. Learning which is which and doing it fast is the whole job. Imagine being handed a piano with 300 keys and being told a stranger's evening depends on you hitting the right one. The chords themselves have a personality and not a pleasant one. They're weighted at the base so they retract when you're done, which sounds helpful until one snaps back at the wrong moment. They tangle, they stick. They get warm under your fingers after hours of use. You learn to handle them like a card dealer handles a deck quick and sure, sliding a plug home without even looking. A new operator fumbles, a seasoned one barely glances down. The difference is months of aching repetition. Then there are the lights, your constant blinking taskmasters. When someone in town lifts their receiver, a small lamp glows on your board, silently demanding attention. When you've connected them, another light tells you the call is live. When they hang up, the light changes again. Your cue to pull the cord and free it up. During a busy spell, the whole board lights up like a Christmas display, and every single light is a person who wants something from you right now. There is no pause button. There is only the next light. The sound of the room is its own strange music. The soft clatter of plugs, the murmur of dozens of operators all saying number please at once, the faint buzz of the lines, the squeak of chairs. It blends into a low hum that follows you home and rings in your ears as you fall asleep. Some nights you hear it in your dreams, a phantom switchboard demanding to be answered. Ever had a song stuck in your head for hours? Imagine that. But it's the gentle drone of an entire town trying to make phone calls. And the board never rests, not really. Even in the quiet hours, a light could blink at any second, and you have to be ready. You don't lean back, you don't relax, you don't let your guard drop. You sit poised, hands near the cords, eyes scanning the rows, a coiled spring in a tidy blouse. The machine doesn't care that you're tired. It doesn't care that your back hurts. It only cares that a light is glowing and no one has answered it yet. By the end of your first day, your fingers are sore, your eyes are crossed, and the wall of holes haunts you. But you've met the monster and you've survived. Now, you just have to learn to speak its language. Beginning with 2 small soul-defining words, it's time to learn the 2 words that will haunt your dreams. Number, please. Every single call begins with them, spoken in a tone so warm and even that it could soothe a screaming baby or a furious banker. You're not allowed to sound tired, bored, annoyed, or human. You say it the same way at 8 in the morning as you do at the end of a 9-hour shift, when your soul has left your body and is floating somewhere near the ceiling fan. The company has rules about exactly how you speak, how fast, how friendly, and how you must never, ever let your real feelings leak into your voice. You're a customer service angel, and the halo is mandatory. Those 2 words are not casual. They're a performance, repeated hundreds, sometimes thousands of times a day. The company drilled into you precisely how they should sound. Pleasant, clear, neither rushed nor slow, with a gentle rising note on pleas that signalled patience and warmth. You practiced until the phrase lost all meaning, becoming pure tone, a little melody you could produce on command no matter how you felt inside. It's like saying your own name so many times it stopped sounding real. The discipline behind it was almost military. There were correct ways to handle nearly every situation, and you were expected to know them all. If a caller was confused, you guided them gently. If a caller was rude, you stayed sweet. If a caller shouted, you absorbed it like a pillow absorbs a fist, calm and soft and unbothered. Your voice was the company's product, and a single sharp note could be marked against you. Ever tried to stay polite to someone screaming about their phone bill while a supervisor scribbles notes about your tone? That was Tuesday. There were rules for what you could and couldn't say too. You didn't chat. You didn't editorialize. You didn't offer opinions, make jokes, or let curiosity creep into your questions. The script was tight, and you stayed inside it. A caller might be telling you something fascinating, scandalous, or heartbreaking, and your only permitted response was a calm, neutral, helpful phrase. You were a voice with no personality of its own, by design. This relentless evenness took a strange toll. Holding a single emotional register for 9 hours is exhausting in a way that's hard to explain. Your real feelings didn't vanish. They just had nowhere to go. You might be furious, grieving, or giddy with good news, and none of it could touch your voice. You learned to split yourself in 2. The serene operator on the line, and the actual human being trapped quietly behind her. By the end of a shift, reuniting those 2 halves took effort. The company believed, not entirely wrongly, that the voice was everything. To the caller, you weren't a person in a chair. You were the telephone itself, the friendly spirit inside the wire. If you sounded warm, the whole system felt warm. If you sounded cold, the company seemed cold. So they polished your voice like silverware and inspected it constantly, because your tone was the brand, and the brand had to gleam. And so, number please became less a question and more a reflex, a phrase stitched so deeply into you that you'd murmur it in your sleep, answer your own front door with it, nearly say it to your mother at dinner. 2 small words, endlessly repeated, the opening note of every tiny drama that crossed your board. You'd mastered the sound of the job. Now you had to look the part too, for an audience that would never ever see you. Let's talk about your appearance, which is strange because no caller will ever lay eyes on you. And yet, you're expected to show up looking immaculate. Pressed blouse, tidy hair, modest skirt, sensible shoes. The logic was that a tidy operator was a disciplined operator, and discipline meant fewer mistakes. So you dress for an audience that exists entirely over a wire. It's a bit like getting fully done up to record a voicemail, but the company believed appearance and behaviour were stitched together, and the woman who slouched in a wrinkled blouse was the woman who would plug the wrong cord into the mayor's private line. You learn to look the part, even for an audience of nobody. The standards were genuinely strict. Your hair had to be neat and pinned back, off your face and away from your headset. Your clothes had to be clean, pressed and modest. Nothing flashy, nothing wrinkled, nothing that suggested you'd rolled out of bed and onto the streetcar. Your nails were checked. Your shoes were checked. In some offices, a supervisor inspected the rows of operators each morning like a sergeant reviewing troops, except the troops were armed with brass plugs and impeccable diction. The reasoning was a tidy little theory the company believed in completely. They thought outward order produced inward order. A woman who took pride in her appearance would take pride in her work. A woman who let herself go would let the call slip too. There's no evidence this was actually true, but it didn't need to be true. It only needed to be policy. So you ironed your blouse at dawn for a job where your blouse was as relevant as the weather on the moon. There was also a deeper, quieter reason: respectability. The telephone company sold trust. People were handing over their conversations, their secrets, their emergencies to invisible women they'd never meet. The company wanted those women to be and to feel unimpeachable. A neat, modest, disciplined operator was a trustworthy one, at least in the public imagination. Your tidy appearance wasn't for the caller's eyes, it was for the company's image of itself, and it shaped how you carried yourself, even alone in that dim room. Dressing the part has a funny way of making you act the part. Sit up straight in a crisp blouse and you feel like a professional. Slouch in something rumpled and the whole performance sags. The uniform of respectability, even unseen, kept your spine straight and your tone bright. You were essentially in costume for a play with no visible audience, and somehow that made you a better performer. Of course, the irony was thick enough to cut. You'd spend 9 hours immaculately presented, hair perfect, posture flawless, for a stream of strangers who pictured you as nothing more than a disembodied voice. A man could be picturing a glamorous starlet or a kindly grandmother on the other end, and you'd never correct him because he'd never know. You were a beautifully wrapped gift no one would ever open, polished daily for the sheer principle of the thing. There was a small dignity in it, though, buried under the absurdity. In a world that gave women few respectable paths, looking and feeling professional mattered. The blouse, the posture, the neat hair, they were armour and pride rolled together. You weren't just a girl on a chair. You were a working woman with standards, and you wore them like a quiet badge. So you dressed each morning for an audience of no one and everyone, looking your best for the wires. And as you settled into your seat, freshly pressed and perfectly poised, you'd feel a familiar chill on the back of your neck. Because someone was watching you. She was always watching you. Now meet the woman who turns this job from difficult into nerve-shredding. The supervisor. She patrols the rows of operators like a hawk in sensible heels, listening in on your calls, timing your responses, and noting every flaw on a little card. Was your greeting half a second slow? Noted. Did you sound the tiniest bit sharp with a rude caller? Noted. Did you slump? Did you sigh? Did you have the audacity to scratch your nose? You feel her presence even when you can't see her, a cold prickle on the back of your neck. There's no chatting, no daydreaming, no relaxing. You're being measured by the second, and the measurements never stop. The supervisor was usually a former operator herself, which made her both expert and merciless. She knew every shortcut, every excuse, every little way an operator might try to ease the pressure, because she'd once tried them all. You couldn't fool her by faking warmth or rushing a call when you thought no one was listening. She'd work the board. She could read your performance the way a music teacher reads a wrong note, instantly and without sympathy. Her main weapon was the silent listen-in. At any moment, without warning, she could plug into your line and hear exactly what you were doing. You never knew when. That uncertainty was the whole point. It meant you had to perform flawlessly every second, because the second you relaxed might be the second she was there. It's like having a teacher who could pop up behind you at random for 9 straight hours, except this teacher could end your career with a frown, and she kept records, meticulous ones. Your speed, your tone, your accuracy, your posture, all of it could end up tallied on cards and reports. Too many slow connections and you'd hear about it. A complaint from a caller and you'd hear about it. A pattern of small lapses and your job itself could wobble. The job ran on numbers, and you were one of them, measured and graded like a schoolchild who never got to graduate. The physical surveillance was just as relentless. Supervisors walked the aisles, eyes sweeping the rows for any sign of slacking. A slouched back, a wandering gaze, a whispered word to the operator beside you. Any of it could draw a sharp look or a quiet correction. You learned to sit perfectly upright, eyes forward, hands ready for hours on end, like a soldier at attention who occasionally connects phone calls. Comfort was suspicious. Stillness was virtue. This created a strange, low-grade dread that simply lived in your body. You weren't being yelled at. You weren't being abused exactly. You were just being watched, constantly, and judged by impossible standards of speed and sweetness. That kind of pressure doesn't explode, it seeps. It settled into your shoulders and the back of your neck and stayed there. Ever felt someone reading over your shoulder while you typed? Now stretch that feeling across an entire career. And yet, the supervisors weren't villains, not really. They were caught in the same machine, pressured from above to keep the boards fast and the callers happy, passing that pressure down because it had nowhere else to go. Some were cruel. Many were simply tired women doing a hard job, enforcing rules they hadn't written. You feared them, but on the rare, gentle days you understood them. So you sat, upright and bright-voiced, performing for an unseen audience and a very seen supervisor, every second of every shift. It was exhausting in a way that bone-deep tiredness can't quite describe. But there was one part of the job no supervisor could grade, one feat you pulled off entirely inside your own head, because somehow you'd memorized the whole town. Let's talk about your memory, because it's about to do the work of an entire computer. In a small town, you don't just connect numbers, you know them. You know that the Hendersons are on a party line with the Caldwells, that Dr. Pruitt takes calls at all hours, that the drugstore answers slower after lunch. You memorize exchange names like Klondike, Pioneer, and Sycamore, and the digits that follow, until the whole town lives inside your skull as a map of voices. People call and simply say, "Get me the church," or "Ring my sister," and you know exactly who they mean. You are the original autocomplete, except you run on coffee and sheer dread. In the smaller towns, this wasn't a party trick, it was the job. There were no screens to glance at, no search bar to type into. There was your training, your printed lists, and increasingly your own memory, which absorbed the town's connections like a sponge soaks up water. After a few months on the board, you carried hundreds of names and numbers in your head, paired and cross-referenced, ready to summon in an instant. Your brain became the town directory, and it was always open. But it went far beyond mere numbers. You learned the rhythms of the place. You knew which businesses got busy in the morning and which went quiet after lunch. You knew the doctor answered at any hour and the lawyer answered at none. You knew who called whom and when and roughly why. You weren't just connecting lines. You were navigating a living social map, one you'd memorized without ever meaning to. It was like knowing not just everyone's address, but everyone's habits. People came to rely on this completely. A caller might pick up and simply say, "Get me Mother," or "Ring the school," or "Connect me to Harold," with no number at all. And you'd do it, because you knew. You knew Mother lived out on the county road. You knew which school they meant. You knew which Harold among the 3 in town this particular caller would want. To them it felt like magic. To you it was Tuesday, and your memory was simply doing what it did. The exchange names alone were their own poetry to learn. Numbers back then often began with a word. Klondike, Pioneer, Sycamore, Cedar, dozens of them, each tied to a region or neighborhood. You learned which exchange covered which part of town, so a name and a few digits told you instantly where the call was headed. It was a system designed to be human and memorable, and you'd internalize the whole map of it until it was second nature. This deep knowledge gave you a quiet kind of power, though you'd never call it that. You understood the shape of the town better than the mayor did. You knew who talked to whom, which families were close, which businesses leaned on each other, who was connected to everyone and who called no one at all. You held the town's whole web of relationships in your head, every thread of it, simply because connecting those threads was your daily work. And it changed how you saw the place. Walking down the street on your day off, you didn't just see neighbours, you saw nodes in a network only you could fully picture. That house called this one. That shop relied on that bank. The whole town hummed with invisible lines, and you were one of the few people who could see them all. It was a strange way to know your home, intimate and oddly lonely at once. But all that memorizing led you straight into the single strangest feature of 1950s phone life, a tangle of shared wires and shared secrets that made privacy almost impossible. It's time to talk about the party line. It's time to explain the strangest thing about 1950s phone life, the party line. Many homes didn't have a private line at all. Instead, several households, sometimes as many as 8 or 10, shared a single wire. That meant when you connected a call, half the neighbourhood could quietly pick up their receivers and listen along. Privacy was a rumour. Folks developed special ring patterns so they knew which call was theirs. 2 short rings for the Millers, 1 long for the Days. And you, the operator, sat at the very centre of this tangled web of shared wires, the one person who could see exactly who was talking to whom. The town thought it had secrets. You knew better. The party line existed for a simple reason. Money. Running a separate wire to every single home was expensive, especially in rural areas and smaller towns. So the company strung one line and shared it among many households, splitting the cost and the wire alike. It was practical and affordable, and it turned the telephone into something closer to a neighbourhood bulletin board than a private channel. Imagine if your phone calls were technically a group chat that anyone on your street could silently join. The ring patterns were the clever part. Since everyone on the line heard the phone ring, each household got its own distinct pattern, a code in rings. 2 shorts for one family, a long and a short for another, a single long ring for a third. You'd learn these patterns and ring accordingly, and the families learned to listen for their own. It was an elegant little system, like Morse code for the kitchen wall, letting 10 homes share one wire without total chaos. Of course, the system also meant that listening in was effortless and constant. When the line rang, everyone on it knew someone was getting a call, and the temptation to gently lift the receiver and eavesdrop was, for many people, completely irresistible. You'd hear the soft click of extra listeners joining a call, the faint background breathing of neighbours who absolutely should not have been there. Whole conversations played out before a quiet, invisible audience. It was the original open secret. This made privacy almost a fiction, and everyone simply adapted to it. People learned to speak carefully on the party line, to hint rather than state, to save the truly private things for face-to-face talks. Some families feuded over hogging the line. Others bonded over the shared eavesdropping, trading the news they'd overheard like currency. The party line wove the neighbourhood together in a tangle of shared wires and shared business, whether anyone liked it or not. And you sat above it all. From your seat at the board you could see the whole structure plainly. Who shared a line with whom? Who called constantly? Who never called at all? You connected the calls that the neighbours then quietly listened to. You knew the architecture of the town's gossip before the gossip even happened. While the listeners caught fragments, you saw the full map, every shared wire, and every connection laid out in front of you like a diagram of the town's nervous system. It gave you a peculiar view of human nature too. You watched people guard secrets on a system designed to leak them. You saw the careful dance of folks who knew the neighbours might be listening and talked anyway. The party line revealed how badly people wanted to connect, even when connection meant surrendering their privacy entirely. They accepted the eavesdropping as the price of being heard. But the listeners on the party line only caught what drifted across one shared wire. You had access to something far more complete and far more dangerous, because to do your job at all, you sometimes had to listen too. And that opened a door the rules told you never, ever to walk through. Let's address the elephant on the switchboard. You could hear everything. To connect a call, you sometimes had to stay on the line a moment to make sure it went through. To disconnect it, you had to check whether they were still talking. In those small windows, voices poured into your headset, raw and unguarded, because no one truly believed someone was there. You weren't supposed to linger. The rules were strict, but you were a human being with ears, and the temptation to stay 1 second longer than necessary was always there, humming quietly like the lines themselves. Most operators resisted, some didn't, and all of them heard far more than they ever let on. The mechanics of the job made some listening unavoidable. When you connected two parties, you often had to confirm the call had gone through, that someone had answered, that the line was clear. When a call ended, you had to verify both sides had hung up before pulling the cord so you didn't cut off a conversation still in progress. Each of these checks meant a moment on the line, a brief window where the voices flowed straight into your ear. You weren't snooping. You were doing your job. The hearing came free with the work, but those brief windows were intimate in a way that's hard to overstate. People spoke on the phone as if they were entirely alone, because as far as they knew, they were. They didn't picture a young woman in a dim room with a headset pressed to her skull. So they spoke freely, carelessly, truthfully. In those few seconds, you caught people at their most unguarded, the moment before they remembered to perform. It was like accidentally reading a single sentence of someone's diary, over and over all day long. The rules around this were ironclad and constantly repeated. You were not to listen beyond what the work required. You were not to linger, not to eavesdrop, not to breathe a word of anything you happened to overhear. Secrecy of communication was sacred, drilled into you from your first day, enforced with the threat of instant dismissal. The company knew exactly what kind of access it was handing you, and it built a wall of rules around that access, hoping the wall would hold, and mostly it did. The pride of the profession was discretion. Operators understood that their entire usefulness rested on trust, and that trust rested on silence. A town would not pour its life through a wire if it thought the wire had a wagging tongue. So the vast majority of operators held the line, literally and figuratively, hearing fragments of 1,000 private lives and locking everyone away. It was a discipline as demanding as the posture and the tone, just invisible. But you were human, and the temptation was real. There were calls that begged to be heard a moment longer, a voice trembling on the edge of something, an argument cresting, a secret half-spoken. The cord was already in your hand. One more second wouldn't hurt. No one would ever know. That whisper of temptation sat with every operator, quiet and constant. Resisting it, hundreds of times a day, was its own small act of character. A few inevitably gave in. There were always stories of operators who knew a little too much, who let a knowing look slip, who became the quiet source of a town's mysteriously well-informed rumours. They were the exception, and they risked everything, because an operator caught listening was an operator with no future. But their existence proved the point. The power was real, and the only thing holding it back was the discipline of the woman wearing the headset. So you heard the unguarded voices, and you said nothing, and you pulled the cord. And some of what you heard you'd carry quietly for the rest of your life, especially the secrets people were most desperate to keep, the ones whispered late at night by voices that thought no one could possibly be listening. Now we wander into dangerous territory, the secrets people couldn't keep off the wire. You learned, without ever trying to, which married man called a certain woman every Thursday when his wife visited her mother. You heard the soft, careful voices of people who thought distance, and a telephone made them invisible. You connected the calls, said nothing, and kept your face perfectly blank when you passed those same people on the street the next morning. You knew who loved whom, who was lying to whom, and who was about to get caught. And you carried it all in silence, because the moment an operator gossiped, she wasn't just fired. She was finished. The patterns gave them away, even when the words didn't. You'd notice the same two numbers connecting at the same odd hours, week after week. You'd hear the particular softness in a voice that doesn't belong in an ordinary call. You'd connect a man to a number that wasn't his home and wasn't his office, and you'd know, in the quiet way you knew most things, exactly what kind of call this was. You didn't go looking for it. The information simply arrived, again and again, and assembled itself into a picture. What made it so strange was the contrast between the wire and the street. The same man whose Thursday calls you connected would tip his hat to you at the grocer's, polite and ordinary, his secret tucked safely behind his smile. He had no idea you knew. To him you were a faceless voice, part of the machinery. To you he was a walking story whose ending you could already guess. Imagine knowing the plot twist of a play while the actor performs the first act, certain he's fooling everyone. You became remarkably good at the blank face. It was a survival skill, really. You'd connect a delicate call, hear a snatch of something you shouldn't, and then go about your evening as if your head weren't full of other people's secrets. You'd nod to neighbours, make small talk, smile at the very people whose private dramas hummed quietly in your memory. The face you showed the town was as smooth, and even as the voice you used on the board. Neither one ever cracked. The temptation to tell must have been enormous, and yet almost no one did, because the stakes were total. A gossiping operator didn't just lose her job, she destroyed the entire foundation of the profession. The town trusted the wire because it trusted the silence. One loose tongue could poison that trust for every operator in the building. So you swallowed it, all of it, the affairs and the lies and the slow-motion scandals, and you said nothing to anyone, ever. There was a loneliness in that, a particular kind that's easy to miss. You knew the truest, rawest things about your neighbours, and you could never acknowledge a word of it. You couldn't warn the wife, you couldn't comfort the heartbroken, you couldn't even hint that you understood. You held the town's most intimate truths in one hand and a vow of total silence in the other, and you balanced them every single day. It was knowledge without permission to use it, and you saw the consequences play out too from your strange vantage point. You connected the calls that began affairs and sometimes the frantic calls when they were discovered. You heard the beginning and occasionally the bitter end. You watched marriages strain and break across the wire, knowing more about the collapse than the couple's own families did. You were a silent witness to the secret life of the entire town, present for everything, party to nothing. But not every secret you carried was a matter of the heart. Some wore suits and sat behind desks. Some were measured in dollars and debts, whispered just as carefully and guarded just as fiercely. Because money, it turned out, was the most private thing in town of all. Let's talk about the secrets that wore suits. You overheard businessmen arranging deals, farmers begging the bank for more time, and families quietly discussing what they could and couldn't afford. You knew which shop was about to fold before the owner admitted it to himself. You heard the strain in a voice asking for a loan, and the false cheer in the voice denying it. In a small town, money was the most private thing of all, more private than romance, and you were trusted with it daily, whether anyone meant to trust you or not. You held the financial pulse of the whole community in your headset, and you never spent a cent of that knowledge. In a small town, everyone's finances were technically a secret and practically an open question. Folks judged each other by their solvency, their debts, their ability to keep up appearances. So money talk happened carefully, in lowered voices, often by telephone, where a man could plead with the bank without his neighbours watching his face. He just didn't realise that pleading went straight through you. You heard the careful arithmetic of people trying to stay afloat, the desperation under the polite phrasing. You learned to read the financial weather of the town before anyone else did. A flurry of calls to the bank from a struggling business. A farmer's voice cracking as he asked for one more month. A shopkeeper's forced brightness as he reassured a creditor everything was fine when you'd heard 3 other calls that said it wasn't. You knew which families were quietly drowning and which were secretly thriving, all from the patterns and tones that crossed your board. You were an economic forecaster who never published a word. The business deals were their own theatre. You'd connect merchants arranging prices, men negotiating terms, partners hashing out arrangements they wanted no one else to hear. You caught the moment a deal turned, the pause before a yes, the tightness before a no. You knew who was buying, who was selling, who was bluffing. If you'd been a different sort of person, the knowledge alone could have made you rich. But you connected the cord, kept your mouth shut, and went home to your modest wage. That contrast never stopped being strange. You held the financial secrets of the wealthiest people in town, and you were paid almost nothing to do it. You knew the banker's worried calls, the rich man's quiet troubles, the businessman's hidden gamble, and your own paycheck was thin enough to make a church mouse wince. It's a peculiar position, being the underpaid keeper of everyone else's fortunes. You were trusted with millions in a sense, and entrusted with very little of it yourself. The desperation was the hardest part to hear. The voice of a father asking for more time on a loan, knowing his family depended on the answer. The forced steadiness of someone trying not to sound as frightened as they were. You heard people at the edge of ruin, speaking carefully so as not to fall, and you couldn't offer a word of comfort or a shred of help. You just connected them to the bank and listened, helpless, as the answer came down. Some of those voices stayed with you long after the cord was pulled, and the secrecy mattered even more here than with the affairs, in its way. A whisper that a business was failing could finish it off. A rumour that a family was broke could shut every door in town to them. Financial reputation was survival, and you held the truth that could shatter it. So you guarded the money secrets as fiercely as any of the others, knowing that a careless word could topple someone who was barely standing. Your silence wasn't just professional. It was quietly a kind of mercy. So you carried the affairs and the debts, the love and the money, all locked away behind your steady voice and blank face. And it was beginning to take a toll, not just on your conscience, but on your body. Because sitting perfectly still and perfectly sweet for 9 hours, it turns out, is a quiet kind of war. It's time for the heavy ones, the calls that still sit in your chest years later. You connected the doctor to the family in the middle of the night. You placed the call that told a mother her son wasn't coming home. You heard the silence after the news landed, the kind of silence that has weight. You couldn't comfort them, couldn't say a word, couldn't even let them know you were there. You simply pulled the cord when it was over and moved on to the next blinking light, carrying that grief quietly into the rest of your shift. The town never saw you cry, but you did sometimes in the break room between calls. These were the calls no operator forgot. A telephone in the 1950s carried the worst news a family could receive, and it carried it through you. When tragedy struck, the line lit up, and you were the one who connected the message to the people about to be changed forever. You didn't choose these calls. They simply arrived, like all the others, a small light blinking among dozens, giving no warning of the weight it held. The mechanics were the same as any call, which made them somehow harder. You connected the parties, confirmed the line was clear, and then, in the brief moment before you withdrew, you sometimes heard it. The first words of terrible news, or the sound a person makes when their world tilts. You weren't trying to hear it, but the work put you there, present at the threshold of someone's worst day, an unwilling witness to a grief that wasn't yours. And you could do nothing. That was the cruelty of it. Every instinct in you might want to say something gentle, to offer a word of comfort, to acknowledge the human being on the other end. But your role forbade it. You were the connection, not a participant. So you stayed silent, pulled the cord when the call was done, and let the family have their privacy in the dark. The kindest thing you could offer was your absence. The silence after bad news was the part that lingered. You learned what real silence sounds like, the kind that follows a sentence no one can take back. It wasn't empty. It was full, heavy, alive with shock. You heard it more than once, that pause where a person absorbs something unbearable, and then you let them go to face it alone. You never got used to it. You only got better at carrying it. What made it strangest was that you had no time to feel it. The board didn't pause for grief. The moment one heavy call ended, another light blinked, and you had to gather your steady voice and your bright tone and answer it as if nothing had happened. You just heard a family's heartbreak, and 3 seconds later you were saying "number please" to someone calling about a delivery. You learned to fold the heavy things away fast because the work demanded it. The toll of that was quiet but real. You carried fragments of other people's worst moments, absorbed without permission and held without release. There was no one to tell, no way to process it, no acknowledgement that you'd been there at all, so you held it. Some nights it caught up with you, in the break room or on the walk home, a delayed wait settling in once the board finally let you go, and yet you came back the next day and the next, ready to be the steady voice in the dark when it was needed. There was a quiet dignity in that, in being the calm point through which a town's hardest news travelled. Not every call was a tragedy, though. Some calls crossed mountains and oceans, and those felt almost like magic. Let's brighten things up and talk about long distance, the glamorous, complicated, expensive corner of your job. Calling another city wasn't as simple as dialing. It went through you. You'd plug into trunk lines, coordinate with operators in other towns, and stitch together a conversation across hundreds of miles like a switchboard relay race. People only called long distance for big reasons: weddings, deaths, soldiers, emergencies. So when that light blinked, you knew something important was happening somewhere. You were the invisible bridge between a man in one state and his sweetheart in another, and for a few crackling minutes you made the whole vast country feel small. Long distance was a different animal entirely from connecting two neighbours. A local call was a quick plug and done. A long-distance call was a production, a chain of connections stretching across the map. You couldn't simply reach the other city yourself. You had to route the call through special trunk lines and hand it off to operators in other towns, who passed it along again until the chain finally reached its destination. It was teamwork across distances, dozens of invisible women linking arms over hundreds of miles. The coordination required real skill. You'd connect to a distant operator, relay the number you needed, and wait while she worked her end of the chain. You'd track which trunk lines were free, manage the timing, and keep the calling party informed while the connection was built piece by piece. A single long-distance call could take real effort and several minutes just to set up. It was less like flipping a switch and more like conducting a small scattered orchestra you couldn't see, and it cost a fortune, which is why people only made these calls for the big moments. Long distance was expensive enough that families saved it for occasions that truly mattered. So when that particular light blinked, you knew the call carried weight. A wedding announcement, a birth, a death, a soldier far from home, an emergency too urgent for a letter. You were rarely connecting idle chatter across the miles. You were connecting the milestones of people's lives. That gave the work a strange intimacy. You were the bridge for some of the most emotional moments imaginable. A son calling his mother from across the country, a couple separated by distance and longing, a family gathering news from far away. For a few crackling, expensive minutes, your work collapsed the enormous distance between them. You took two people who might never see each other and let them share a voice. It felt on the good days like a small miracle you helped perform. The technical side had its own romance too. The lines crackled and hissed, voices arriving thin and far away, sometimes fading, sometimes surging. You'd nurse a fragile connection across the miles, willing it to hold long enough for the conversation to matter. When it worked, when two distant voices finally met clearly through all that wire and effort, there was a quiet satisfaction in it. You'd reached across the country and made it whole just for a moment. It also reminded you how vast and connected the world really was. From your seat in one small town, you touched a web that stretched across the entire nation, operator to operator, line to line, all the way to the coast and back. You were a single node in something enormous, part of an invisible network of women holding the country together one call at a time. It made your dim little room feel briefly, thrillingly large. But long distance or local, magic or routine, every call took something from you physically. Because while your voice stayed light and your tone stayed warm, your body was quietly paying the bill for every hour you sat at that board. Now let's talk about what this job does to you physically, because sitting still is harder than it sounds. Your headset is heavy and presses into your skull until you can feel your own heartbeat in your ear. Your arms ache from reaching across the board hundreds of times an hour. Your back rebels against the rigid posture you're required to hold. Your voice, sweet and steady on the outside, grows raw and tired underneath. By the end of a shift, your neck is stiff, your fingers are sore, and your jaw aches from smiling into a wire that couldn't see you. The job looks gentle from the outside. Your body knows the truth. The headset was the first thing to wear you down. Early models were heavy, clamped firmly to your head, pressing against your ear and skull for hours at a stretch. By midday you could feel it, a dull ache where the weight sat, a ringing in the ear it covered. Some operators developed real hearing strain from the constant pressure and the endless stream of voices funneled directly into one ear. Imagine wearing a heavy clamp on your head for 9 hours while 100 strangers talk into it. That was the baseline. Then there was the reaching. The board rose up in front of you, jacks stacked in rows, some of them at the very edge of your reach. To connect a call you stretched, plugged and retracted over and over hundreds of times an hour. Your arms and shoulders carried that motion all day, the same reach repeated until the muscles burned. It was repetitive strain before anyone had a name for it. A quiet, grinding ache that built through the shift and followed you home. The posture was its own slow torment. You sat upright, you stayed alert, you didn't slouch, because slouching drew a supervisor's eye and threw off your reach. Holding a rigid position for hours does something to a body. Your back stiffened, your neck locked. The simple act of staying perfectly composed, hour after hour, exhausted muscles you didn't know you had. It's like holding a polite smile so long your face forgets how to relax. And your voice, the very tool of your trade, took a beating too. Speaking constantly, sweetly, evenly, for an entire shift wore the throat raw. You couldn't rasp, couldn't croak, couldn't let the strain show, so you pushed through it, keeping the tone bright even as your voice tired underneath. By the end of the day your throat ached and your jaw was sore from the steady smiling diction you were required to maintain. The warmth callers heard cost you something real to produce. The strangest ache of all was the jaw from smiling at no one. The company believed a smile could be heard in the voice, and they weren't entirely wrong, so you smiled into the headset, into the wire, into the void, for hours. Your face held that pleasant expression for an audience that would never see it, until your cheeks and jaw protested. You performed friendliness with your whole face for people who only ever knew your voice. All of this added up to a job that looked effortless and felt grueling. From the outside, you were just a woman sitting in a chair, talking on the phone. No heavy lifting, no danger, no obvious toil, but your body knew the difference between looking gentle and being gentle. You went home stiff, sore, hoarse, and drained, having done work that left no visible mark but settled deep into your muscles and bones. And as if the physical strain weren't enough, the job found one more small, undignified way to test you. Because even the most basic human need came with rules, a schedule, and a stopwatch. Let's discuss something deeply undignified. Your bathroom breaks were rationed. You couldn't simply stand up and leave. The board never stopped blinking and someone had to cover your position. So breaks were scheduled, supervised and timed, and woe to the woman who took too long. Operators learned to drink very little water during shifts, a quiet, uncomfortable strategy that saved them from the humiliating dance of asking permission to be human. Imagine running an entire town's communications while also negotiating with your own bladder like it's a hostile foreign power. Glamorous, it was not. But you adapted, because everyone did, one carefully rationed sip at a time. The problem was structural. The board could never go unattended. Every operator covered a section of the town's calls, and if she stood up and walked away, those calls simply went unanswered, lights blinking into the void. So you couldn't just excuse yourself when nature called. Someone had to slide into your seat first, and that someone was usually already busy. Leaving your position was a logistical event, not a personal decision. So breaks became a managed system, doled out on a schedule and watched by supervisors. You went when you were told you could go, not when your body decided. If the board was busy, your break might be pushed back. If you lingered too long, it was noticed, timed, and possibly noted. The most basic bodily function in the world was transformed into a scheduled, supervised, faintly humiliating transaction. You raised your hand to be human and waited for permission. This led to a quiet, widespread, and slightly absurd strategy. Drink as little as possible. Operators learned to limit their water intake during shifts, not because they weren't thirsty, but because needing the bathroom was such an inconvenience. It was a small, uncomfortable adaptation that thousands of women simply accepted as part of the job. You spent 9 hours mildly parched rather than face the awkward dance of requesting relief. Dignity traded away one skipped glass of water at a time. The indignity of it stung more than the discomfort. These were skilled professionals, holding a town's communications together, trusted with its deepest secrets and its emergencies, and they had to ask permission to use the restroom like school children. The contrast was stark. You could be the calm voice that saved a life 1 minute, and a grown woman quietly hoping your scheduled break came soon the next. The job demanded immense responsibility and granted startlingly little autonomy, and the timing pressure was real. A break that ran long could draw a supervisor's attention, another mark in a profession already thick with marks, so you hurried. Always, even in the one moment meant to be a pause. There was no leisurely breather, no relaxed step away. You went quickly, returned quickly, and slid back into your seat before the board could miss you too much. Even rest was a race against the clock. Yet, as with everything else, you adapted. You learned the rhythms, planned around them, rationed your water, and made peace with a system that treated your body as one more thing to be scheduled. It was undignified, yes, but it was survivable, and survival was the whole art of the job. You bent yourself around the board's needs until the bending became second nature, one carefully managed break at a time. So you sat, parched and poised, bending even your most basic needs to the demands of the wire. But not every duty was a hardship. Some parts of the job were almost tender. Small kindnesses you offered the town in the quiet hours, like being the keeper of its very sense of time. It's time to talk about your gentler duties, the ones that felt almost tender. People called simply to ask the time, and you'd tell them, warm and certain, like a clock with a heartbeat. Others arranged wake-up calls, trusting you to ring them at 5 a.m. so they wouldn't miss the train or the shift or the bus to the city. You became a quiet caretaker of the town's daily rhythm, nudging strangers awake, reminding them of the hour, keeping the whole place running on schedule. It was small, repetitive work. But to the man who couldn't afford to oversleep, your voice at dawn was the most important sound in the world. The time requests were constant and oddly charming. In an age before everyone owned a reliable clock, people simply called to ask the hour. They'd lift the receiver and you'd tell them plainly and pleasantly, and they'd thank you and hang up. You were a living timepiece, a human clock with a soothing voice, dispensing the hour to anyone who asked. It seems quaint now, but to a household without an accurate clock, you were the authority on what time it actually was. The wake-up calls were where the real trust lived. A man who couldn't afford to oversleep, who had a train to catch or a shift to start or a bus to the city, would arrange for you to ring him at a set hour. And he'd go to sleep trusting that you, a stranger he'd never met, would be there at 5 a.m. to wake him. That trust was remarkable when you think about it. His livelihood rested on your reliability, on a promise made over a wire to a voice without a face, and you took it seriously because you understood what was riding on it. Forgetting a wake-up call wasn't a small slip. It could mean a missed train, a lost shift, a docked wage, a real consequence for someone living close to the edge. So you remembered. You watched the clock, and when the hour came, you rang the line and gently coaxed a stranger out of sleep. For those few seconds, you were the most important sound in his world, the difference between making it and missing it. There was something tender in being the one who woke the town. In the dark hours before dawn, while most people slept, you were ringing the workers awake, one by one, nudging the early risers into their days. You were the soft alarm for the people the world depended on, the bakers and the labourers and the commuters. They never saw you, never thanked you properly, but their mornings began with your voice. You set the town in motion before it even knew it was moving. These gentle duties balanced the heavier parts of the job in a quiet way. After the tragedies and the secrets and the strain, there was something restorative about simply telling someone the time or wishing a stranger a good morning as you woke him. These were calls with no weight, no hidden grief, no temptation, just small acts of service. They reminded you that the job wasn't only burden. Sometimes it was simply kindness dispensed over a wire. And over time you became a fixture of the town's daily rhythm without anyone quite noticing. You kept the hours, woke the workers, marked the passing of each ordinary day. The town ran on a schedule, and you were quietly part of the clockwork, a steady presence threading through everyone's mornings and evenings. You held the town's sense of time as surely as you held its secrets, both of them carried in the same warm, even voice. But your duties weren't all gentle nudges and friendly hours. Sometimes the light that blinked carried genuine panic, a true emergency with no one else to call. And in those moments, you stopped being a clock and became the only thing standing between someone and disaster. Now we reached the moments that mattered most. There was no emergency number to dial. If a house caught fire, if a child stopped breathing, if a man clutched his chest at midnight, people didn't call for help. They called you. And in that instant, you stopped being an operator and became the entire emergency system of the town. You'd connect them to the doctor, the fire brigade, the police, all while keeping the panicking caller calm with nothing but your voice. Lives genuinely depended on how fast your hands moved and how steady you stayed. No training montage prepared you. You simply rose to it, again and again, because there was no one else. It's hard to overstate how different this was from today. There was no single emergency number, no dispatch centre, no system designed to summon help. There was the telephone, and there was you. When disaster struck, people did the only thing they could. They picked up the receiver and reached the operator. You were the front door to every kind of help the town could offer, and that door opened straight onto your headset. So when the panicked light blinked, everything changed. A voice would come through, frightened, breathless, sometimes barely able to speak, and in that instant you became the calm centre of someone's worst moment. You had to think fast. Who do they need? The doctor? The fire brigade? The police? You knew the numbers, knew who answered at which hours, knew the fastest way to summon aid. Your memorised map of the town suddenly became a map of rescue, and you had to manage the caller while you did it. A terrified person isn't easy to understand. They babble, they panic, they forget where they are. So you steadied them with your voice, drew the crucial details out of them, kept them from falling apart long enough to get the information you needed. All of this while your hands flew across the board, plugging in the help that might save a life. You were calming a stranger and dispatching aid in the same breath, with no script and no time. The weight of it was enormous, and it landed without warning. 1 second you were connecting an ordinary call. The next you held a life in your hands. There was no preparation for the specific emergency, no chance to brace yourself. The light simply blinked, and you answered. And suddenly everything depended on your speed and your steadiness. You rose to it because there was no alternative. Hesitation was a luxury the moment didn't allow. What's remarkable is how often these women did rise to it, with no formal training for crisis at all. They were hired for their voices and their diction, not their nerves under fire, and yet when the emergency came, they performed. They summoned doctors in the dead of night, raised the alarm for fires, sent help to the injured and the dying. Ordinary young women became, in an instant, the calm and capable heart of the town's emergency response, simply because the job demanded it of them. And then, just as fast, it was over. Help was on its way, the cord was pulled, and the next light was already blinking. You just helped save a life, or tried to, and now someone wanted to be connected to the hardware store. You folded the adrenaline away and answered in your steady voice, carrying the weight of what just happened quietly into the rest of your shift. No applause, no acknowledgement, just the next call. That was the job. You held lives in your hands, kept the town's secrets, woke its workers, and connected its every conversation. And for all of that, all that skill and responsibility and grace under pressure, the company paid you a wage that would make you laugh, if it didn't make you sigh. Let's talk about money, specifically how little of it you made. For all your skill, all your memory, all your grace under pressure, your paycheck was thin. The work was considered respectable, and respectable apparently meant you should be grateful rather than well paid. You held the secrets of the rich and the lifelines of the desperate, and you went home to a modest room with a modest wage. The company knew young women had few other options, and they priced your labour accordingly. You were essential, irreplaceable, and quietly underpaid, the beating heart of the town's communication, valued more in words than in dollars. The gap between your value and your pay was almost comical. Consider what you actually did. You held the entire town's communications together, memorized hundreds of connections, kept its deepest secrets, woke its workers, and served as its emergency response system. By any honest measure, you were essential infrastructure, and yet your paycheck suggested you were barely worth keeping. The math simply didn't add up unless you understood the logic the company was actually running on. That logic was simple and a little cynical. Young, unmarried women in that era had very few respectable career options. The telephone company knew this perfectly well. They knew you couldn't easily walk into a better-paying job somewhere else, because those jobs largely didn't exist for women like you. So they paid you what they could get away with, which was not much, secure in the knowledge that you had limited alternatives. Your lack of options was, quietly, part of their business model. The word respectable did a lot of heavy lifting here. Operator work was clean, dignified, and well regarded, a real step up from factory or domestic labour. And the company leaned on that prestige hard, as if the respect itself were part of your compensation. You were supposed to feel fortunate, even grateful, for the privilege of the position. Gratitude, it turned out, was cheaper than fair wages, and the company spent it freely. The contrast with what you knew was almost surreal. You connected the calls of the town's wealthier citizens. You overheard their deals, their fortunes, their financial secrets. You held the prosperity of the whole community in your headset, and you understood the flow of its money better than most. Then you went home to a small modest room and a small modest wage, having spent the day immersed in riches that would never be yours. You were the underpaid keeper of everyone else's wealth, and there was little you could do about it. The work was steady, the prestige was real, and the alternatives were few, so you accepted the thin paycheck, as nearly every operator did, and found what dignity you could in the work itself rather than the wages. You took pride in your skill, your reliability, your place in the town. The pride was real, even if the pay wasn't. It had to be, because the pride was most of what you got. Still, there was a quiet injustice in it that's worth naming. A workforce of skilled, dedicated, irreplaceable women, holding a community together, underpaid precisely because they were women with nowhere else to go. The company built its entire operation on their labour and rewarded that labour with respectability and a pittance. You were the beating heart of the town's communication, valued endlessly in words and barely at all in dollars. But thin wages weren't the only way the job kept its operators in their place. There was another rule, unspoken and ironclad, that put your career and your personal life on a collision course from the very first day. Because in many places, the moment you became a wife, you stopped being an operator. Here's a strange one. In many places, getting married could cost you your job. The companies preferred their operators young and unmarried, believing a wife belonged at home rather than at a switchboard. So you watched colleagues quietly hide engagement rings, or leave entirely once they wed. Your career and your personal life were set on a collision course from the start, and everyone knew which one was expected to win. It's a peculiar cruelty. Building a workforce out of women and then punishing them for living a full life. But that was the deal, unspoken and ironclad, and you lived inside its strange, narrow rules. The marriage bar, as it came to be known, was a widespread practice across many kinds of women's work in this era, and telephone operating was no exception. The reasoning was rooted in the assumptions of the time. A married woman, the thinking went, belonged at home tending a household. Her wages should come from her husband, not an employer, and a job held by a wife was a job that should rightfully go to a single woman who still needed it. So companies simply expected their operators to leave once they married, and often required it. This put every operator on a quiet clock. You could pour years into mastering the board, building your skill and your standing, and all of it carried an expiration date stamped the day you said your vows. Your career wasn't built to last, it was built to end the moment your personal life advanced. You were, in a sense, hired with the understanding that you'd eventually be fired by your own happiness. Few jobs frame their own obsolescence quite so plainly. So women adapted, the way women always did under these rules. Some hid their engagements, slipping rings off before their shifts, keeping their plans secret as long as they could. Some kept their marriages quiet entirely, married in private and hoped no one would notice. Others simply accepted the end, working until the wedding, and then walking away from the board for good. You watched colleagues you'd trained beside vanish from the rows one by one as their lives moved forward and their jobs fell away. The cruelty of it was layered and quiet. The companies built their entire workforce out of women, depended on them completely, and then structured the work so that living a full life, marrying, building a family meant giving it up. You couldn't have both. You couldn't be a wife and the voice of the town. You had to choose, or rather the choice was made for you. It was a system that used women's labour and then quietly punished them for being women with lives of their own. It also kept the workforce perpetually young and perpetually turning over, which suited the company fine. A steady stream of new single women cycled through the boards, trained up and then married off, replaced by the next batch. There was no path to a long career, no accumulation of seniority into old age, no growing old at the switchboard for most. The job was a chapter, not a lifetime, and the company wrote the ending in advance. For you, living inside that rule, it shaped everything quietly. Your work and your future pulled in opposite directions, and you knew it every day. You loved the job, or at least respected it, and you knew it couldn't hold you forever. You measured your time at the board against the rest of your life and understood that one would eventually have to give way. It lent the whole experience a faint, ticking impermanence. So you lived inside the narrow rules, balancing a career with a built-in end against a life you weren't supposed to fully have, and under all of it ran the constant grinding pressure to be perfect, because the rules left no room for error. And nothing showed that more brutally than a single wrong chord. Let's talk about mistakes, because in this job they were instant and public. Plug a cord into the wrong hole, and you've connected two strangers mid-sentence, or cut off the mayor while he's mid-rant, or dropped a long-distance call that someone waited a week to make. There was no undo button, no apologetic email, just two confused voices and a supervisor's pen scratching against her card. The pressure to be perfect, hour after hour, call after call, was relentless. One slip and the whole illusion of effortless grace shattered. You learned to move fast but careful, your hands trembling slightly behind a voice that never let on you were terrified. The unforgiving thing about switchboard mistakes was their immediacy. There was no buffer, no draft, no chance to catch yourself before anyone noticed. The moment your plug went into the wrong jack, the error was live, happening in real time in someone's ear. You connected the wrong parties, and two strangers were suddenly talking to each other in confusion. You pulled the wrong cord and an important call simply died. The mistake and its consequence arrived in the same instant, and the consequences could be embarrassing or genuinely costly. Cut off the wrong call and you might sever a businessman mid-deal, or drop a long-distance connection that someone had saved for and waited days to make. Connect the wrong lines and you'd interrupt private conversations, cross wires, create small chaos in people's afternoons. Each slip rippled outward immediately, and there was no taking it back. You couldn't apologize your way out of a call that had already gone wrong. The damage was done the second your hand moved. Hovering over all of it was the supervisor and her card. Mistakes weren't just embarrassing. They were recorded. A wrong connection, a dropped call, a slow response. Any of it could end up tallied against you. Another mark in the profession's endless accounting of your performance. So a single slip carried weight beyond the moment. It became evidence, a small black mark in a record that followed you. The fear wasn't only of the error itself, but of the pen that documented it. This bred a particular kind of sustained tension. You had to be fast because the board never stopped and the lights never waited. But you also had to be flawless because every mistake was instant and recorded. Speed and perfection held together for 9 hours straight, with no margin for the ordinary human tendency to slip. It's a brutal combination. Most jobs let you trade speed for accuracy or accuracy for speed. This one demanded both, always with someone watching. So you developed a strange duality in your own hands. They moved quickly, practiced and sure, sliding plugs home with the ease of long repetition. And yet underneath, there was often a faint tremble, the body's honest response to relentless pressure. You learned to work through that tremor, to let your trained hands do their job, even when your nerves were frayed. The competence was real, but so was the fear humming quietly beneath it. And your voice, of course, never betrayed any of it. That was the deeper performance. You could connect a wrong chord, feel the spike of panic, scramble to fix it, all while your voice stayed warm, even and unbothered. The caller heard serenity. Inside, you were racing. The gap between the calm voice and the frightened operator behind it was where the real labour of the job lived, the constant effort of appearing effortless, that relentless pressure to be perfect, alone, with no room for error and no one to lean on, could have crushed you. But it didn't, and the reason why takes us off the board and into the one room where the mask finally came down. Because you weren't truly alone. You had the others. Now let's step into the break room, where the real magic happened. You and the other operators formed your own quiet sisterhood, a private world built on shared exhaustion and unspoken understanding. You couldn't gossip about callers, not really, but you could share a look, a sigh, a knowing glance when a particular light blinked. You traded survival tips, covered each other's breaks, and learned who could be trusted with the heavy days. The job isolated you from the town's secrets and bonded you fiercely to each other. Out there you were invisible voices. In here you were a family, holding the whole community together with cords and silence. The bond formed naturally, the way it always does among people who share something hard. No one else could fully understand what your day was like. Your family heard you were a telephone operator and pictured something pleasant and easy. Only the woman in the next seat truly knew the weight of the headset, the ache of the posture, the strain of the endless sweetness, the secrets you couldn't tell. That shared understanding, unspoken and complete, drew the operators together into something close-knit and protective. You communicated in a private language of small signals. You couldn't gossip about the calls, couldn't share the secrets you carried, but you could catch a colleague's eye across the rows and convey a whole world in a glance. A raised eyebrow when a particular light blinked, a weary sigh during a long shift, a small, knowing look that said, "I heard that one too, and we'll never speak of it." It was communication stripped down to its barest, most human form, and it bound you together. The practical support mattered just as much. You covered each other's breaks so a colleague could finally use the restroom. You quietly helped when someone's board got overwhelmed. You learned who could handle the heavy days and who needed a steadying word, and you looked out for one another accordingly. In a job designed around individual performance and constant judgment, the operators built a quiet web of mutual care, holding each other up where the company never would. The break room was the one place the mask came down. Out on the floor you were poised, perfect, performing serenity for callers and supervisors alike. But in those few stolen minutes between shifts, surrounded by women who understood, you could finally exhale. You could be tired, be human, be yourself. You could let the strain show on your face because the faces around you carried the same strain. It was a small sanctuary and it kept you sane. There was a deep irony in how the job shaped your connections. It cut you off from the town entirely. You knew everyone's secrets and could share them with no one. You served the whole community and were known to none of it. Just a faceless voice. The work isolated you from the very people whose lives you held. And yet that same isolation drove you straight into the arms of the other operators, the only ones who could truly know you. The job took one kind of connection and gave you another. And what a connection it was. These were the women who understood the unspeakable parts of your work, who carried the same secrets and the same silence, who knew the weight you couldn't set down anywhere else. The friendships forged at the switchboard ran deep precisely because they were built on things that couldn't be shared with anyone outside that room. You were a sisterhood of secret keepers, bound by everything you couldn't say. Together you held the whole town together with cords and silence, invisible to everyone but each other. But the bustle of the shared shift, the glances and the sighs and the steady company didn't last all day, because when the town finally went to sleep, the room emptied out and a different kind of shift began, one that was quiet and strange and deeply, profoundly alone. It's time for the small, quiet hours when the town sleeps and you don't. The night shift is a different world. The board barely blinks, the room is dim and still, and the calls that do come are different too. Lonelier, stranger, sadder. The insomniac who just wants to hear a voice. The drunk man trying to reach a woman who stopped answering long ago. The frightened child whose parents aren't home. In the deep of the night, you're less an operator and more a single glowing window in a dark town. The one person awake and listening. It's eerie, it's tiring, and somehow it's the shift that feels most like sacred duty. The night shift transformed the whole job. Gone was the bustle, the rows of busy operators, the constant chatter of number pleas rippling through the room. In its place came a deep, humming stillness. The board sat mostly dark, a light blinking only now and then. The supervisor's footsteps echoed in a way they never did by day. You sat in the dim quiet, alert but unhurried, keeping watch over a sleeping town. It was peaceful and unsettling in equal measure. And the calls that came were different in character entirely. Daytime calls were practical. Business, errands, arrangements, the ordinary traffic of waking life. Nighttime calls were something else. They came from the people the daylight didn't reach. The sleepless, the troubled, the lonely, the afraid. When that light blinked at 3 a.m, you never quite knew what you'd find on the other end, but you knew it would carry a weight that daytime calls rarely did. There was the insomniac, who maybe didn't need a connection at all, just the sound of a steady voice in the dark. There was the man who'd been drinking, trying again and again to reach someone who'd long since stopped wanting to hear from him. There was sometimes the frightened child alone in a house with parents out for the evening, reaching for the only voice available. Each one came to you because, in the dead of night, you were the one light still on, the one ear still listening. That gave the night shift a strange intimacy. By day, you were one of many, a faceless voice in a vast system. By night you were singular, the lone keeper of the town's open line, present for its quietest and most vulnerable hours. People reached out in the dark in ways they never would in daylight, and you received it all, steady and calm, the unseen companion of everyone who couldn't sleep. You were the town's nightlight in a sense, glowing quietly while it dreamed. The strangeness wore on you, though. There's something deeply tiring about being awake while the world sleeps, alert in the stillness, your body fighting its own desire to rest. The hours crawled, the quiet pressed in, the occasional lonely call broke the silence and then returned you to it. You sat with your own thoughts more than on any day shift, alone with the dim board and the dark windows and the slow, strange procession of midnight voices. It was a particular kind of tired, bone deep and lonely. And yet, oddly, it felt like the most meaningful shift of all. There was a quiet nobility in being the one awake, the one available, the one steady presence for the people the night had left adrift. You weren't just connecting calls. You were keeping a kind of vigil over the town, holding the line so that no one, not even at 3 a.m, was entirely alone. It felt less like a job and more like a duty, sacred in its quiet way. And among those midnight voices were a special few, the ones who didn't really want a connection at all. They wanted something simpler and harder to give. They just wanted someone to talk to. Let's talk about your loneliest callers, the ones who didn't really need a connection at all. Some folks called just to hear a kind voice, the widow who asked the time twice a day, the old man who lingered a moment too long before saying goodbye. You weren't supposed to chat. But you came to recognize them, these gentle, solitary souls reaching out through the only line they had to the world. A few warm words from you might be the only conversation they had all day. You couldn't fix their loneliness, but you could be steady and present and human. For the 30 seconds the rules allowed, you came to know them by their patterns. The widow who called to ask the time, not once but twice a day, far more often than anyone needed to know the hour. The old man who'd request a connection and then linger, drawing out the goodbye, reluctant to let the line go quiet. They weren't really calling for the time or the connection. They were calling for the contact, for the brief warmth of another human voice in a life that had grown very quiet. And you understood that, even if neither of you ever said it. These were the people the world had quietly set aside, the elderly, the widowed, the isolated, living alone in their houses with no one to talk to from morning to night. The telephone was their one thread to the rest of humanity, and you were the voice at the other end of it. For some of them, the few seconds they spent with you might have been the only conversation they had all day. That's a heavy thing to realise about a 30-second call about the time. The rules, of course, said you shouldn't chat. Your job was to connect and disconnect, briskly and pleasantly, and move on to the next light. There was no allowance for conversation, no time built in for kindness beyond the script. And yet, faced with a lonely voice that clearly wanted nothing more than a moment of warmth, you found small ways to give it. A slightly gentler tone, a few extra kind words, a goodbye that didn't rush them off the line quite so fast. Tiny mercies tucked into the cracks of the rules. You couldn't fix what was wrong, and you knew it. You couldn't cure their loneliness, couldn't fill the empty houses, couldn't be the friend or family they were missing. The most you could offer was a brief, steady presence, a reminder that someone out there was kind and listening, if only for a moment. It wasn't much. But to a person who'd spoken to no one else all day, a warm voice and a gentle goodbye could mean more than you'd ever know. There was something quietly sad in recognizing them, in knowing their loneliness by the rhythm of their calls. You held that knowledge the way you held everything else, silently, carrying it through your shift. You knew which voices belonged to the solitary souls, knew that for them the telephone was a lifeline of the gentlest kind. And you did what little the job allowed, which was simply to be human with them, briefly, before the next light called you away. It revealed something about the telephone itself, and about you. The wire wasn't only for business and emergencies and secrets. For some, it was the last thread of connection to a world that had moved on without them. And you, the operator, were the human being at the other end of that thread, holding it gently for everyone who needed it. You couldn't give them company, but you could give them a moment of being heard, and sometimes that was everything. All of it, the secrets, the emergencies, the lonely voices, came back to the single hardest thing this job asked of you: to know everything about everyone, and to say absolutely nothing, ever. That impossible weight sat at the very heart of what you were. Now we reach the heart of it, the impossible weight of knowing everything and saying nothing. You signed on to secrecy. You meant it. But you were a person, full of opinions and feelings, walking through a town whose deepest truths you carried in your memory. You knew who was cheating, who was broke, who was sick, who was lying, and you smiled and said good morning and kept it all locked away. The discipline that took is hard to overstate. You became a vault with a heartbeat, trusted by everyone precisely because you never breathed a word. It was a quiet kind of heroism, performed entirely in silence. The oath was real, and you took it seriously. Secrecy of communication was the foundation of the entire profession, drilled into you from the start and enforced with the threat of immediate ruin. You promised never to repeat what crossed your board, and you meant the promise. But keeping it was a different matter than making it, because you weren't a machine. You were a living person, and the secrets you carried were the living secrets of people you saw every day. That was the crux of the difficulty. You didn't carry the town's secrets in the abstract. You carried them about specific people, your neighbours, the faces you passed on the street, the families you'd known your whole life. You knew which marriage was quietly collapsing, which family was sliding into debt, which person was hiding an illness, which respectable citizen was living a double life. And then you'd see those very people at the market, at church, on the sidewalk, and you'd smile and say good morning as if you knew nothing at all. The discipline that required is genuinely hard to overstate. Every human instinct pushes us to share what we know, to warn, to comfort, to gossip, to connect through the trading of information. You had to override that instinct constantly, 100 times a day, for years. You held knowledge that could comfort the betrayed, warn the endangered, or simply satisfy ordinary curiosity, and you held all of it perfectly still. You became a vault, sealed and silent, even as your heart responded to everything you knew. It made you, in a strange way, both the most trusted and the most alone person in town. Trusted, because everyone's secrets were safe with you, even the ones they didn't know they'd given you. Alone, because you could share none of it, could never fully be known yourself, could never set down the weight you carried. You were intimate with the whole town's inner life, and intimate with no one about your own. That's a particular kind of solitude, dense and quiet. There was no relief valve either. You couldn't go home and unburden yourself to family, couldn't tell a friend the remarkable thing you'd heard, couldn't even hint. The other operators understood the weight, but even they couldn't share the specifics. So the secrets simply accumulated inside you, year after year, a private archive of the town's truest self that would die with you, untold. You were a living record that no one would ever read, and yet you held it faithfully, and that faithfulness was its own quiet heroism, not the dramatic kind, with applause and recognition. The invisible kind, performed in silence, noticed by no one. The town trusted its whole inner life to you precisely because you never gave them reason not to. You were the keeper of everything, and you kept it day after day, asking nothing in return. It was a kind of integrity that left no monument, only an absence of harm. But even as you held the line so faithfully, a quiet rival was coming for your job, one that would never need an oath of silence because it had no ears at all. It sat in homes across the town, spinning and clicking, and it was about to make you obsolete. Let's talk about the shadow growing at the edge of your world, the dial telephone. Slowly, town by town, the company began installing phones that let people connect calls themselves, no operator required. At first it seemed harmless, even helpful, but you felt the chill of what it meant. Every dial installed was a cord you'd never plug again, a job quietly disappearing into a spinning wheel of numbers. The future was coming for the switchboard, and it was efficient, tireless, and utterly without ears. The machine could connect a call. It just couldn't know the town, comfort the frightened, or carry a secret. But the company didn't seem to mind. The dial phone arrived with the gleam of progress. It let people connect their own calls by spinning a numbered wheel, routing the connection automatically through equipment that needed no human hand. It was faster in its way, and it freed callers from waiting for an operator. To the company, it was efficiency itself, a system that could handle the town's calls without paying anyone to sit at a board. To the public, it was the exciting modern future arriving on the wall of their kitchen. At first, it spread slowly, and it was easy to tell yourself it didn't matter. One neighbourhood got dials, then another. The board stayed busy enough. The change felt gradual, almost gentle. But you understood, in a way the cheerful advertisements didn't mention, exactly what each new dial meant. It meant one fewer call that needed you, one fewer cord for your hands to plug. The work was being quietly disassembled, connection by connection, and routed through a machine instead. The chill of it was hard to shake. You'd built a skill, a memory, a whole way of being useful, and here came a spinning wheel that made all of it unnecessary. The dial didn't need to memorize the town. It didn't need a sweet voice or perfect posture or years of training. It just needed someone to turn it. Everything that made you good at the job, the machine simply rendered beside the point. Your expertise was becoming a relic before your eyes, and yet you knew something the machine could never replace, even if the company chose not to count it. The dial could connect a call, yes, but it couldn't know that Get Me Mother meant the house on the county road. It couldn't stay calm while a panicked voice reported a fire and dispatch help in the same breath. It couldn't soften its tone for the lonely widow or wake the worker gently at dawn. It couldn't carry a secret, because it had no ears to hear one. It connected wires. You connected people. That was the quiet tragedy of it. The parts of your job that were merely mechanical, the plugging and routing, were exactly the parts the machine could do. But the parts that mattered most, the knowing, the comforting, the judgment, the humanity, simply didn't fit into the company's ledger. They couldn't be measured or billed, so they weren't valued. The dial couldn't do them, and the company decided that was fine. Efficiency had spoken, and efficiency didn't care what was lost. So you watched the future arrive, knowing it had no place for you in it. The dial spread, town by town, wall by wall, each one a small farewell to the work you'd given so much to. It was tireless and cheap and modern, everything the company wanted, and utterly without the soul you'd brought to the board. The machine won not because it was better, but because it was cheaper, and that, in the end, was enough. And so the boards began to go dark one by one, and a whole way of being connected started its slow and quiet fade into history. And so we arrive at the end, the slow fading of the woman behind the wire. One by one the boards went dark. The dial and later the push button swept the operators aside, and the town lost something it didn't quite notice losing. A living memory, a steady voice, a keeper of its secrets. The new system was faster and cheaper, and never tired. But it never knew your name, never rang you awake with kindness, never stayed on the line a heartbeat longer to make sure you were all right. The hello girls clocked out for the last time, and a whole way of being connected simply ended quietly, the way all their best work had always been done. The end came the way the dials had spread, gradually and without ceremony. A board would handle fewer calls, then fewer still, until one day it simply wasn't needed anymore. Operators were let go in waves, their positions absorbed by the tireless machinery. The great walls of cords and lights, once the beating centre of a town's life, fell silent. The rooms that had hummed with dozens of voices saying number please went quiet. An entire profession dimmed and disappeared, a little at a time. And the town lost something in the bargain, though most people never quite registered it. They gained convenience, certainly, the ability to connect their own calls instantly without waiting. But they lost the living intelligence behind the wire. They lost the voice that knew the town by heart, that remembered which herald they meant, that woke them with kindness and stayed steady in their emergencies. They traded a person for a process, and the process worked, and so they didn't mourn what was gone. They simply moved on. The new system was undeniably better at the things that could be measured. It was faster. It was cheaper. It never tired, never made a mistake born of exhaustion, never needed a scheduled bathroom break or a fair wage or a day off. By every figure on the company's ledger, it was an improvement. The machine was, in the cold accounting of efficiency, simply superior. And in that accounting, that was all that mattered. But the machine never knew your name. It never recognized a regular's voice or understood the loneliness behind a second call asking for the time. It never rang a worker awake with a gentle word at dawn, never stayed on the line a heartbeat longer to make sure a frightened caller was all right, never carried a secret because it never heard one. Everything you'd been beyond a mechanism, all the quiet humanity you'd brought to the wire, the machine couldn't replicate and didn't try. It connected calls. It did nothing else, because there was nothing else it could do. And so the hello girls clocked out for the last time. They hung up their headsets, left the dim rooms behind, and walked out into a world that had quietly decided it no longer needed them. There was no grand farewell, no monument, no town gathered to thank them for the years of secrets kept and lives connected and mornings begun. They simply finished their final shifts and went home, and the boards went dark behind them. It was a fitting end, in a way, for women whose best work had always been invisible. They'd served in silence, kept their secrets in silence, carried the town's whole inner life in silence, and in silence they departed, their contribution as unremarked at its ending as it had been at its height. A whole way of being connected, warm and human and flawed and kind, simply ended, quietly, the way all their best work had always been done. They were the voices that knew everything and said nothing, the keepers of a town's heart who asked for no thanks and received none. And though the wires they tended have long gone cold, something of them lingers, a reminder that connection was once a deeply human thing, held together by women who listened and remembered and never told. Before they ever let you near a live call, you had to go to school, and not the fun kind. Once you were hired, the company put you through weeks of training, because connecting a town's worth of conversations turned out to be far more complicated than plugging things into holes and smiling. You sat in a classroom with other nervous young women, all of you learning the chords, the lights, the scripts, and the 1,000 small rules that governed every second at the board. It was part trade school, part finishing school, and part gentle interrogation about whether you could really keep your voice sweet under pressure. And it was only the beginning of becoming the voice of the town. The first thing they trained was the thing you thought you already knew how to do: talk. Your everyday voice was not good enough. It was too fast, too casual, too regional, too human. So they drilled you in diction, in pacing, in tone, teaching you to speak with a clarity and warmth that didn't come naturally to anyone. You practiced the company phrases until they lost all meaning, repeating number, please and thank you, and one moment until the words became pure sound. It was like learning a second language, except the language was just being relentlessly pleasant. Then came the board itself, which they introduced slowly, like a dangerous animal. You learned the jacks and the chords on a practice setup, connecting imaginary calls, building the muscle memory before any real person's evening depended on you. The instructors watched your hands, correcting your reach, your grip, your speed. They wanted the motions burned in so deep that you could do them without thinking, because once you hit the live board, thinking was a luxury you wouldn't have time for. Slow hands meant blinking lights, and blinking lights meant trouble. The rules were the heaviest part of the curriculum. There were procedures for everything: how to greet a caller, how to handle confusion, how to manage a rude voice, how to place a long-distance call through the chain of distant operators. There were rules about secrecy, repeated until they were carved into you. There were rules about posture, about tone, about what you could and could not say. You memorized them all, a whole code of conduct for a job that looked, from the outside, like simply answering the phone. They also tested your temperament quietly. The instructors wanted to know if you could stay calm when a caller shouted, sweet when you were exhausted, steady when everything went wrong at once. They threw difficult scenarios at you and watched how you bent. Some women, it turned out, simply couldn't hold the mask, couldn't keep the warmth in their voice when the pressure rose. The training weeded them out gently. The job needed women who could be unflappable for 9 hours straight, and not everyone was built for it. By the end, you weren't the same person who'd walked in. You'd been reshaped into an operator, your voice retrained, your hands retrained, your whole bearing adjusted to the demands of the board. You could say the phrases in your sleep. You could connect a call without looking. You'd absorbed the rules so completely that breaking them felt physically wrong. The company had taken a nervous young woman and built a professional, polished and precise, ready to be the invisible heart of the town. And then they sent you to the live board, where all that careful training met the messy reality of actual human beings. Most of whom, it turned out, called for ordinary reasons, but some of them called to make your life difficult on purpose, and learning to handle those was an education no classroom could provide. Let's talk about the holidays, which for everyone else meant warmth and family, and for you meant the busiest, loneliest day of the year. The town did not stop needing telephones because it was Christmas. If anything, it needed them more. Families called families, distant relatives reached across the miles, and the long-distance lines lit up like the very decorations everyone else was admiring. And someone had to connect all of it, which meant someone had to sit at the board while the rest of the world gathered around its tables. That someone, often enough, was you. The holidays were a strange paradox for an operator. The work was at its most joyful and its most relentless at the same time. You connected calls full of laughter and love, Families separated by distance finally hearing each other's voices, soldiers reaching home, grandparents talking to grandchildren they rarely saw. It was beautiful in its way, a whole town's worth of connection flowing through your hands on the warmest day of the year. And you were the one making it happen, even as you sat apart from any of it. Because while you connected everyone else's holiday, you were not having one. You were at the board in the dim room, plugging cords and saying number please, while your own family gathered somewhere without you. The shifts didn't pause for Christmas. The lights kept blinking. The long-distance chain still needed its human links. So you reported for duty on the day everyone else stayed home, and you spent it serving the very celebrations you were missing. It's a particular kind of lonely, being the invisible thread in 100 happy reunions you weren't part of. The volume alone was punishing. Long-distance calls, normally reserved for big occasions, came flooding in all at once, because Christmas was the biggest occasion of all. The trunk lines jammed. The waits grew long. Callers, eager to reach their loved ones, grew impatient as you worked through the backlog one connection at a time. You stayed sweet through all of it, of course, wishing strangers a Merry Christmas in your steady, warm voice, while your own holiday slipped quietly past outside the window. There were small mercies among the operators. The break room became a little warmer on those days, the sisterhood a little closer. You shared what food you'd brought, traded tired smiles, made the best of being together when you all would rather have been elsewhere. If you couldn't be home, at least you weren't alone in not being home. The other women understood exactly what the day cost because it cost them the same. You held each other up through the long holiday shift, the way you held each other up through everything. And there was, buried in the loneliness, a quiet pride. You were part of what made the holidays possible for everyone else. Every joyful call you connected, every distant family you united for a few crackling minutes happened because you were there, faithfully at your post on the day you'd sacrificed your own celebration. The town's Christmas ran through you, unseen and unthanked, and it ran smoothly because you'd shown up. Someone had to keep the wires warm while the world gathered. You were the someone. So you spent the warmest day of the year in service to a warmth you couldn't quite share, connecting joy you watched from the outside. It was the job at its most bittersweet, generous and lonely in equal measure. And not every caller who reached you on those long days was full of holiday cheer. Some of them called for no good reason at all, just to waste your time, test your patience, or hear themselves cause a little trouble. It's time to meet the callers who weren't really calling for anything, the pranksters, the cranks, and the ones who breathed into the receiver and said nothing at all. For every legitimate connection you made, there was the occasional caller who lifted the receiver purely to make your day stranger. Some were bored children, some were bored adults, which was worse, and some were just unpleasant souls who discovered that there was a polite young woman on the line who wasn't allowed to be anything but polite back. You learned to handle them all with the same unbothered sweetness, which frankly drove the worst of them crazy. The children were the most common and the most forgivable. A kid would get hold of the telephone, intrigued by the magic of a voice that answered, and call simply to giggle, ask nonsense, or hang up the instant you responded. They thought it was hilarious. You thought it was a small interruption to a busy board. You'd answer with your usual warmth, get a burst of laughter or silence, and move on. It was harmless mischief, the 1950s version of ringing a doorbell and running away, except the doorbell was you. The adult pranksters were less charming. These were grown people who somehow found it entertaining to waste an operator's time, asking absurd questions, making jokes, pretending to need a connection they didn't want. You'd play along just enough to remain courteous, then guide them off the line as efficiently as the rules allowed. The trick was never letting them get a reaction. They wanted you flustered, annoyed, amused. You gave them a wall of pleasant professionalism instead, and most of them gave up when they realized they couldn't crack it. Then there were the cranks, the genuinely unpleasant callers who phoned to complain, to insult, to vent their bad moods at the only person obligated to listen. You absorbed it. That was the job. A man could rage about his bill, his connection, his bad day, and your only permitted response was calm, kind, and helpful. You became remarkably good at letting hostility roll past you, at staying soft against someone trying very hard to make you hard. It's a strange skill being professionally unprovocable. You earned it one rude caller at a time, and then there were the worst ones, the callers who said nothing at all. Just a lifted receiver, a held silence, the faint sound of someone breathing. These were unsettling in a way the loud cranks never were. You couldn't connect a call no one asked for, couldn't help a caller who wouldn't speak, couldn't quite tell what they wanted. You'd repeat your greeting, wait, and eventually disconnect the empty line, a small chill settling over you. The silent callers reminded you that the wire ran both ways, and not everyone on the other end meant well. What protected you through all of it was the same training that protected you everywhere else. The unshakable, unbothered voice. You couldn't lash out, couldn't snap, couldn't give the troublemakers the rise they craved. So you simply stayed pleasant, endlessly, infuriatingly pleasant, until they ran out of steam. Your sweetness was armor. The crank wanted a fight, the prankster wanted a reaction, the silent caller wanted unease, and you handed them all the same gentle, immovable courtesy. It was the most quietly powerful thing you did. So you weathered the pranks and the cranks and the eerie silences, deflecting them with a kindness they couldn't dent. But not every caller who became attached to your voice was trying to bother you. Some of them, hearing that warmth day after day, fell for it entirely and decided they were in love with a woman they had never seen. Let's talk about your accidental admirers, the men who heard your voice so often that they convinced themselves they were in love with it. You were, after all, a warm and pleasant presence that came through the wire day after day, sweet and steady and endlessly patient. To a lonely man, that warmth could start to feel like something more. So a certain kind of caller would begin to linger, to ask your name, to find reasons to reach the operator a little more often than he strictly needed. You'd never met him, he'd never seen you. And somehow he was smitten with a person who was really just doing her job. It happened more than you might think. Your voice was designed to be appealing, trained into warmth and patience, offered to every caller alike. But a man hearing it regularly didn't know it was a performance for the whole town. To him, that gentle attention felt personal, felt aimed at him, felt like the beginning of something. He fell for the voice and built a whole imagined woman behind it, sweet and kind and waiting just for him. The truth, that you sounded exactly the same to 100 other callers, never crossed his mind. The signs were familiar. He'd call more often than necessary, inventing small needs just to hear you answer. He'd try to draw out the conversation past what the rules allowed. He'd ask your name, your hours, whether you'd be on the board tomorrow. Some grew bold enough to declare their feelings outright to a woman whose face they'd never seen. It was flattering, in a strange way, and awkward in a much larger one, because you couldn't exactly tell him that he'd fallen for a customer service tone. You handled it the way you handled everything, with gentle, firm professionalism. You kept your warmth, because warmth was the job, but you didn't encourage him. You deflected the personal questions, redirected to the task at hand, kept a careful distance inside the very closeness your voice created. It was a delicate balance, staying kind without giving false hope, remaining the pleasant operator without becoming the dream he'd built. You'd had practice, most operators had. There was something a little sad in it underneath the awkwardness. These were often lonely men, reaching for connection through the one warm voice available to them, mistaking professional kindness for personal affection. because they had so little of the real thing. They weren't villains, they were just lonely, and your voice was the gentlest part of their day. You couldn't be what they imagined, but you understood why they imagined it. The wire made intimacy out of mere courtesy, and not everyone could tell the difference. It revealed, again, the strange power of being a voice without a face. Callers filled in everything they couldn't see, building whole pictures of you from nothing but tone. Some imagined a glamorous beauty, some a kindly soul, some a woman who might love them back. None of them knew the real you, the tired young woman with the aching neck and the rationed water, performing warmth for a wage. You were a blank screen onto which lonely men projected their hopes, and you could never quite correct the picture. So you fielded the admirers with grace, gently declining to be the woman they dreamed up, staying kind to the very end. It was one more secret you kept, one more bit of human longing that passed through your headset and went nowhere. And just when you thought you understood every shape the job could take, the weather would remind you that connecting calls was sometimes the difference between a town surviving the night and facing it blind. Because when the storm hit, everyone else ran for shelter. You ran for the board. Now we come to the nights the sky turned against the town, and you stayed at your post while everyone else took cover. Storms were an operator's true test. When the wind howled and the snow piled high, or the rain came down in sheets, the telephone became the town's lifeline, and the lifeline ran through you. People needed to reach doctors, to check on family, to summon help, to simply know they weren't alone in the dark. So while the rest of the town huddled inside and waited out the weather, you sat at the board, holding the wires together with both hands. A bad storm changed everything about the job at once. The calls came faster and more frightened, a town suddenly anxious and reaching out all together. The lines themselves grew fragile, battered by wind and ice, crackling and dropping as the weather tore at them. You worked harder to connect anything at all, nursing failing lines, rerouting around damage, doing everything you could to keep even a thread of communication alive. The board became a battlefield, and you were its lone defender, refusing to let the town go silent. The pressure to stay was enormous and unspoken. You couldn't simply leave because the weather was dangerous. The town needed you most precisely when conditions were worst. So operators stayed through blizzards and floods and howling gales, sometimes unable to get home themselves, sleeping at the office, working extended shifts because there was no one to relieve them and no one else who could do the job. You were essential infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't get to clock out when the storm rolls in. And the calls you handled on those nights mattered more than ever. A family cut off and frightened. A medical emergency made worse by impassable roads. Someone trapped, someone injured, someone simply terrified by the dark and the wind. You were their connection to help, the calm voice in the chaos, the one steady point while the world outside came apart. You stayed sweet and clear and capable, even as the building shook and the lines failed, because the people on the other end had nothing else to hold on to. There was real danger in it sometimes, real hardship. Operators who couldn't get home, buildings cold and dark when the power failed, the board running on whatever backup the company had. Long, exhausting hours with no relief in sight, the storm refusing to relent. You endured it because the alternative, a town with no way to call for help in its worst hour, was unthinkable. You weren't being brave for the recognition. You were being brave because no one else could be, not from where you sat. These were the nights that revealed exactly how essential you were, even if no one said so afterward. When the systems people took for granted came under strain, it was the operator who held them together, by hand, by skill, by sheer stubborn refusal to abandon the board. The dial machines that would one day replace you couldn't have done this. They couldn't have nursed a failing line, couldn't have calmed a frightened caller, couldn't have chosen to stay when staying was hard. Only a person could do that, and on the worst nights, the person was you. So you weathered the storms at your post, the town's last and steadiest link to the outside world, asking for nothing and receiving little. It was the job at its most demanding and its most necessary. Proof of everything an operator truly was beneath the sweet voice and the tidy blouse. You were not just a voice on a wire. You were the thread that held a town together when the night turned wild, and you held it without ever letting go. So that was your life behind the wire. You sat upright for 9 hours in an itchy blouse, smiling into a headset at no one, while a supervisor counted your every breath and your bladder filed formal complaints. You memorized an entire town inside your skull, woke strangers gently at dawn, and became the whole emergency system whenever a light blinked with panic. You carried the affairs, the debts, the heartbreaks, and the secrets of everyone you passed on the street, and you never breathed a word of any of it. You were the calm voice in the storm, the keeper of the hours, the lonely glow in a sleeping town. And for all of it, you were paid almost nothing and thanked even less. But you held the line anyway. Through the bad news and the long nights, through the cranks and the lonely callers and the men who fell for a voice, you stayed steady and sweet and present. You connected a whole community to itself, one chord at a time, and asked for nothing in return. So tonight, as you reach for your phone and a call connects itself in an instant, with no waiting, no wire, no woman in a dim room making it happen, maybe spare a quiet thought for the hello girls, the ones who knew everything and said nothing, the ones who held a town's heart in their hands and set it down so gently no one noticed. They clocked out long ago, their boards gone dark, their secrets carried with them into the quiet. Because history isn't only kings and battles. Sometimes it's a tired young woman, listening in the dark, making sure that no one, not even at 3 a.m, was ever truly alone. Sleep well.